Kia ora, I'm Cathi Barker and you're watching a video on pivot tables and pivot charts from my Microsoft Excel Level 3 data manipulation course. Okay, what I've got here is an Excel file with a simple list in a sheet called targets. Now the whole idea with pivot tables, if you're new to pivot tables, is they are supposed to summarize what's going on with a relatively large list. So I have a list here, if I go control down arrow, of 270 records plus one row for the headings. And if I go back up again, so what I want to do is, instead of printing this out and giving it to people, which is data which tells them nothing, I want to create a pivot table that summarizes what's going on with this data. Now to create a pivot table, we go to Insert. You can use these recommended pivot tables here where Excel makes suggestions as to what you could produce in the way of pivot tables based on that data, and I'll let you play with those. I'm going to cancel because I'd rather create a pivot table from scratch. So I'm going to choose pivot table here. Now immediately, because I'm sitting in the data, it immediately wiggles around the outside of the data, and you can see it here, and it picks up the range A1 to H271. So if it didn't pick up the range, cancel, click in the data and simply click Insert Pivot Table to pick it up. Now it's going to put the pivot table in a new worksheet, and I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to go OK. So here is my new worksheet called Sheet 1, and here is my pivot table. Out on the right hand side we have what's called a field list, and up here in the ribbon we have two extra tabs now, Pivot Table Analyze and Design. And that is because we're sitting in a pivot table. Now if I click over here outside of this pivot table report, those two tabs disappear from the ribbon and the field list disappears as well. So I click back on my pivot table report and they reappear. Now in the field list, for example, it may look a little bit different from mine. This is the way I like my field list set up. If you click this button here, which is your Tools button, you can change it to any one of these layouts. So if I click the first option, this is most likely what your field list looks like. I actually find that this area here is too small for me when I'm working on a laptop or I'm working with a large number of columns. So I actually hit this Tools button and I change it to the second option, this layout here. But have a look at the various options available in that Tools button. Okay, so coming back to this right hand side, this is called the field list. If you hit the X and tell it to go away, you can actually hit this button called field list, which is on your pivot table analyze tab in the ribbon, and you'll bring your field list back. You can send it away and bring it up simply with that there. Now in the field list, it immediately picks up the column headings for the list that you were originally sitting in. So if I go back to the list I was originally sitting in targets, the column headings are first name, last name, region, department, year, target, deadline, and actual. And so those are the fields or the column headings you're seeing listed here. And they are listed in the order of the source data. But you may actually hit this Tools button and say, no, could you list them from A to Z? So now I have actual as my first field and year as my last. So you can control the sort order. You can also control the layout using this button here. Now the whole idea is you simply drag these fields and you drop them into these four buckets. This is the most popular way, I should say. So for example, if I was to grab region and drop it in the rows bucket, here is a list of regions from A to Z and a single instance of each region. So even though the source data has region as a column and there's a lot of duplicity in here, when you create a pivot table, it mentions it once. If I grabbed region and thought, don't want it as a row, I want it as a column, I'll simply drop it into the columns bucket, and now you see those regions as columns. If I then change my mind, I can put it back into the rows bucket. So pivot tables is all about having the confidence to drag fields in and out of buckets and moving things around until you land on something that's actually useful in terms of information. If I leave the regions in the rows, I might decide I'll have year as a column. And so there are the years there, 2010, 11, and 12. And if I drag that out with the X, I simply remove the year from the columns. So I could drag years back in. Another way would just be to untick it and it will go away. I could grab department and make those columns. So now I have an intersection of the departments and the regions. And maybe I'll grab the actual sales, actual, and drop that in the values. So now we have a pivot table giving us summarized useful information about our list. I can now see how many sales were made by department. I can see how many sales were made by region. I can see how many sales were made by department and region, 3,300 for Auckland Automotive. And so this is now giving us useful information. And if I grabbed year, I could actually turn that into a filter. Now, a filter sits above the pivot table, and this is showing me all, but I could actually say, no, I just want to see 2012, and okay. And so those are the 2012 figures. If I then go back in there, I could actually ask it to give us multiple items. So I could choose 2012 and 2010. And now it's giving me both of those years. So a very, very helpful way of summarizing information. Now I'd like to change this a little bit. I'd like to get rid of year as a filter, drag that out, get rid of department as a column, and just leave it like this. Now, I might put a heading, sales analysis. And I'll make it 20. All right. Now I want to see sum of actual as dollars. So I click on my pivot table, I go to my values bucket, and I click on sum of actual. And I go into value field settings. In value field settings, you can see what the source name is, but you can give it a different name. So I'm just going to call it total because sum of actual is the total sales. I'm going to keep the function as sum, but I'm going to change the number format. I'd like to format the numbers as accounting with 0 decimal places. So despite how the data is formatted in the original list, how it appears in the pivot table can be quite different. And I'll choose OK. And OK again. And so total is now the column heading. It's still the sum of the actual values, but it's actually showing it now as accounting with 0 decimal places. Now I'd like to analyze this sales data a little bit further, and I'm going to change these row labels to region. So just type region or regions. Let's grab actual in the field list and add it to the values bucket a further 4 times. 1, 2, 3, and one more time, 4. All right, so there is actual mentioned 5 times. So now I'm going to go into my values bucket and click on sum of actual, value field settings, and I'm going to call this one number. So this is the number of sales. So I want to use the count function. Now as soon as I choose count, it changed the name. A little bit of a design error. So let's choose count and then call it number. I'll leave the format as it is, which is just a number, and OK. So this is the number of sales that occurred. They totaled 403,740, but they actually added up to 270 transactions. Now I may want to sort these also that the largest sales region is at the top. So I'm going to right click one of these total figures and I'm going to sort from Z to A. And so there is Topor. Topor's at the top with the largest total sales and a transaction value of 42. Okay, let's look at sum of actual 2. I'm going to give it a click. I'm going to go into value field settings. This time I'd like to choose average, which then affects the name. So I'm just going to take off the last 2 words. I'm going to go into number format, choose accounting and 0 decimal places, and OK. And OK. So even though Topor had the highest sales value and the most number of transactions, the average value of a transaction was actually lower than Kawerau in Auckland. Let's do another one. I'm going to go into sum of actual 3 and value field settings. I think we've got this sus now. We know how to name it, we know how to choose a function, we know how to choose a format. Let's now explore this area here. Show values as. By default it's on no calculation, but I might say, actually, can I have percentage of the column total? And let's give it the name, just the percent symbol, and OK. And so here I have the percentage that each region contributed to the column total. Sum of actual 4. Let's click on this option, value field settings, show values as, and let me show you what else is in here. Besides percentage of the column total, let's have a look. You've got things like difference from, so you could have a base value. You've got running totals, which is awesome. I'm going to rank them from largest to smallest, for example, and let's give it the name ranking. and OK. And so immediately we can see that Topol ranked number 1, contributing 16.06% to the total sales. The average sale was about $1,500. They made a total of 42 transactions, which equated to $64,860. That is a pivot table giving you a summary, useful information based on a large list. Now, let's make another pivot table. You could create a pivot table from scratch, but what I often do is I often duplicate the sheet and then alter the pivot table. So I'm going to hold the Control key and drag sheet 1. Actually, before I do that, let's just name the sheet Analysis. Now I'm going to Control drag Analysis to make a duplicate. Now in here, I'd like the information to be the same, but not by region, by department. So I'm going to pull region out of the rows bucket and put department into the rows bucket, which means that I need to rename this heading here, department, or departments, whatever you prefer. And the only other thing is this here is now showing an error. So I need to get into my ranking in my values bucket and my value field settings, show values as, and that is because here the ranking is based on region. We now need to base it on department and OK. And here we see it here. Now I'm going to right click one of these total values and sort from Z to A, or largest to smallest. So immediately I can see the mechanical department had the most sales. Let's now do the same again, but by year. Hold the Control key, drag Analysis 2 to make Analysis 3, remove department from the rows bucket, add year to the rows bucket. Here is the ranking showing a problem. Let's go into ranking, value field settings, show values as, and the base field should be year, and OK. Immediately I need to change this also to year, and I can see there's a filter at play, so I'm going to clear the filter, and I can see here that the years are all exactly the same. That is just my data. So depending on your data will depend on what results you get. These guys are equally contributing a third. Your data might be very different. Okay, so I've got 3 pivot tables now in 3 separate sheets. Often when I'm developing the different pivot tables, I create them in separate sheets, but then I want to bring them together in a dashboard. So maybe I'll call this analysis sheet dashboard now. On the dashboard, I'd like to show all 3 pivot tables. So I'm going to go to Analysis 2, click on this pivot table, and when you go to Pivot Table Analyze up here, there is actually a Move Pivot Table button. It's in the Actions group. If I move the pivot table, it's now wanting me to select where I want to put it. So I'll go to Dashboard, and maybe I'll go to A17. And OK, and I simply clicked it. And so there it's dropped that pivot table, which means that Analysis 2 now contains nothing, and I can right click Analysis 2 and I can delete it. Let's go and grab Analysis 3, the pivot table that's in there, move it onto the dashboard. Pivot Table Analyze, move Pivot Table, go to Dashboard, maybe click A26 and OK. And I've moved the pivot table onto here. I can go to Analysis 3 and I can now delete that sheet. So you can move pivot tables up a cell, down a cell, or into a completely different sheet, whatever you're after. Now I'd like to change the looks of these pivot tables, so I'm going to click on the first one, I'm going to go to Design, and here's a number of styles, and I might just roll on them to see what they look like and decide which style I'd like to choose. And I'm going to go for this medium 13 style. And I'll do the same with this one, medium 13 as well for consistency, and this one here as well. So you've got a number of different styles, and I might just move that over there. All right. Now, what I'd like to introduce you to now is what we call slices. I need to be able to easily filter and slice these pivot tables. I'm sitting in the first pivot table. I go to Pivot Table Analyze, and I insert Slicer. Now I'd like a slicer for department, for region, and for year. And I choose OK, and here they are here. I'll move department and pop it here, actually over a little bit. I'll move region here, department, and I'll just be a bit rough because I'm going to tidy these up anyway. Actually, I might put them down here for a minute. First of all, let's start with region. If I click on region, I might give that also a sort of a turquoise blue, sky blue look. And I want to make it that it's 3 columns. So over here is a columns option. I'm in the slicer tab and I've got the slicer selected. I'll turn this into 3 columns and immediately it's in 3 columns, and I'll stretch it and adjust the height of it. Now I'll do the same for department. I'm going to change that to 3 columns, stretch it, done. And I'll choose a blue there, or maybe that blue. Now I'll do it for year, stretch it, change it to 3 columns, and resize it. Now when it comes to sizing, I'm just going to clear that. When it comes to sizing, you can actually click on a pivot table or hold the control key and click on the heading of each of the pivot tables and set them to a certain width. Now let me just check the width of the first one. When I click on the first one, the width is 15.52. I'm going to then control click on each of these and make them 15.5. So I know they're all equal width. If I then go to align, I can also align them to the left, so I know that they're all nicely perfectly aligned to the left. If I click on year, I can also choose a different colour, so I might go for purple. Okay, so the whole idea of the slices, if I just take a moment, is if I click on 2010, I'm just seeing the figures for 2010 in this pivot table. If I click on 2011, not much change because they're all the same, and we learnt that earlier. If I click on automotive, these are just the automotive figures, these are just the marketing figures, the sales figures, and notice Tokoro and Kawerau don't have a sales department, and these are the production figures, and there's no production department in Christchurch, Hamilton and Whakatane. If I choose production and choose Taupō, then those are the production figures for Taupō, and if I choose 2010, those are the production figures for Taupō 2010. So it's a way of filtering what you're seeing. And you can clear the filter, and clear the filter. I can drag from Auckland to Christchurch to Hamilton if I want to see all 3 of them, and then clear. Or I can click on Auckland, hold the control key and click on Rotorua, Tokoroa and Tauranga, and I'm seeing those 4. It's a really user-friendly way of actually filtering your pivot table and clear. But the thing you may notice is the pivot table is only affecting the slicer are only affecting the first pivot table. I want these slices to affect all 3 pivot tables. I'm going to click on region, I'm going to go to slicer, and I'm going to choose report connections. Using the report connections, I can say, who are you impacting? And it basically says to me, I'm just affecting, on the sheet called dashboard, I'm just affecting pivot table 2. Well, I want it to affect pivot table 3 and 4, and OK. So now when I choose Auckland, those 3 pivot tables have been affected for Auckland or Rotorua or Tauranga, and clear. If I click on department and I go to report connections, again I want department to affect all 3 pivot tables, and I want year to affect all 3 pivot tables. So when I choose 2010, it affects all 3 of them, mechanical affects all 3 of them, Tokoroa. So these pivot tables are now showing me Tokoroa, mechanical, 2010. Clear, clear, and clear. You have got also slicer settings. So if I click on region, for example, and go into slicer settings, I can change the name or the caption. Region, hold, control to select more than one region. So you can do things like that. It's sorted from A to Z, which is perfect. And there are other options in here as well. But see, hold control to select more than one region. So you've got those options there. So that's the whole idea with slices. Now let's click back on the first pivot table. Let's go back to pivot table analyze and filter connections. That's another way of checking the connections as well. I can see that this pivot table here and its connections in here, and cancel. Insert slicer we looked at, filter connections we looked at. Let's look at insert timeline. If I insert timeline, there's only one date column that we can use. So I'm going to go OK and use deadline. And I'll put the timeline down here, for example, and I'll stretch it out. Now the timeline also can have a certain look. So I might go for maybe this look here. And at the moment in the top right corner, it's showing months, but I could change that to years. And if I clicked on 2022, that would show me the deadlines for 2022, the deadlines for 2020, and the deadlines for 2021. And I can drag and expand it. And I can also change it back to months and click on a certain month I want to see, and then drag it across. Let me just go forward to say this month here, and then just move it forward and select those 4 months there. So if you have got date-driven data, you can use a timeline to also filter. This is showing me May to August 2022 now because I've selected that. Slices and timelines. Now let's clear that filter. If I click back on this pivot table and look at pivot table analyze, that's that group there filtering. Now the next thing I want to show you is that there is this refresh button. If the data in the target sheet should change, you will need to refresh the pivot tables so that they're up to date. And so you can click on a pivot table and you can go to pivot table analyze and you can choose refresh, or if in the case we have here where there's 3 pivot tables, you can ask to refresh all pivot tables. So make sure your pivot tables are up to date and that they're refreshed. One of the things you can do is you can go into the options button here, and in the options button, particularly under data, you can tell it to refresh data whenever the file is open. But often we want to refresh the data quite regularly, so that's when we actually choose the refresh button. And I'll go OK. Now the other thing is when I'm sitting on a pivot table often that I haven't created, I'm often wondering where is it getting its data from? And so that's what the Change Data Source button does. The Change Data Source button actually takes you to the location in which it's getting its data. Now if your data is likely to grow or shrink in length on a regular basis, instead of basing your pivot table on a range, maybe base your pivot table on entire columns. So now I'm basing this pivot table on columns A to H because my data will grow with time. Okay, so as far as clicking on a pivot table and going to pivot table analyze, you can refresh the data or refresh all. You can also check or change what the pivot table is based on. Okay, now let's have a look at a pivot chart. I'm going to, for example, click on this particular pivot table and ask for a pivot chart. I might ask to give it a pie chart and OK. And so if I pop out over here, this is the total sales by region because I was sitting on this particular pivot chart. Now the one thing I don't like with the charts is the grey buttons necessarily. So if that's the case with you, I would go to pivot chart analyze and I'd turn off the field buttons. In fact, I'd hide all of them instead of just some of them. From there, you can do what you normally do with charts. So on the Design tab, for example, you can choose the style of chart, you can choose the layout that you'd like, you can change the various elements of the chart, whether you do or don't need a legend, and you can click on the heading and put a title, such as Total Sales by Region. So pivot charts are really easy to make. All you do is sit on a pivot table and choose which type of pivot chart you would like to create. Let's make another pivot table. This is our dashboard, pretty much done. The last things I'd probably do with regards to the dashboard is I'd take these grid lines off and I'd take these column headings, etc. off. So if I go to View, I'll turn off the grid lines so they no longer appear, and I'll turn off the headings. And so it looks more sort of dashboard-esque. And then I'll go back to targets and make another pivot table. Sitting in this list, I'll go to Insert Pivot Table to create a pivot table. Knowing what I know now, I'll base it on the entire columns A to H because I know my data is going to grow. I don't want to put it in an existing sheet, I'll put it in a new sheet, so I'll go OK. For this, I'd like to choose region as a row, department as a row. So I've actually got 2 rows. So not only can you have multiple fields in your values bucket, but you can have multiple fields in any of these buckets. I might grab actual and put that into values. And so here I can see the actual sales by region and then by department. Now, when you do have 2 rows or more, you do get these little minuses here. So I can hit the minus to collapse Auckland, the minus to collapse Christchurch, but that's quite painful. If you right click, you have the option to expand collapse, and you could expand or collapse the entire field. So if I collapse the entire field, there it is there. I can also filter out the blanks, and I can also name this regions. And I can also call this total sales. If I want to expand all, I right click Auckland, I'll go to expand and collapse, and I'll expand the entire field. So the option is to expand the entire field or just the particular one you're sitting on. Entire field is all of them. Now, when it comes to the design of your pivot table, let's go back to design. We did look at some of the styles in here. So I might choose a style again. Let's go for, say, medium 13. But then you've also got the option such as subtotals. You can show the subtotals at the bottom or the top or not at all. At the moment when I look at it, the subtotal is at the top of Auckland, the top of Christchurch, the top of Hamilton. Some people prefer to have them at the bottom of the group, so you can move it to the bottom of Auckland, the bottom of Christchurch, the bottom of Hamilton. Or you can say do not show at all. Just depends on the nature of your data. Or I might put it back at the top. Grand total, I have a grand total at the very foot here, and the grand totals again can be turned off or on. Your report layout at the moment is what we call compact, but you have the option, if you've got the space, of choosing outline. And I quite like outline, but what I like even better is tabular. And tabular gives you more space, I think it's easier to read, and it puts the totals at the foot of each group. And then what I like to do is add a blank row, insert a blank line between each item. So I get a bit of negative space or blank space between each group. I don't necessarily like the style, so then I can roll around and look at the various styles and decide on a style that I approve of. And I'll leave that up to you. You've also got blank banded rows. If I choose banded rows, you can turn those off or on, or banded columns. So those are options there. So have a look at the various design features and decide which one suits you best. I'm going back to Pivot Table Analyze. Now, what else haven't I covered? We looked at recommended, we looked at pivot chart, we looked at field list, plus and minus buttons. If I unselect this, you'll see the minuses will disappear. So people no longer have the minuses to collapse and expand each region, and that might be what you're after. So you can turn those off or turn those on. And field lists, you can turn the column headings off entirely or turn them on again. That's what those buttons do. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video and got some really good ideas about how pivot tables can really summarise what's going on with a large list. Take care, ka kite.